The Wyoming Territory in July of 1874 stretched endlessly beneath a sky the color of molten steel, where heat waves rose from the fractured earth like the restless spirits of ancient battles. The landscape bore witness to a merciless drought that had transformed once verdant meadows into brittle wastelands of yellow grass that crackled underfoot like the bones of small animals. Even the hardy sagebrush seemed to wilt under the solar furnace above its silver-green leaves, curled tight in futile defense against the blazing heavens. 10-year-old Abigail Harper had been shackled to the iron hitching post outside the abandoned cabin for 3 interminable days, and the metal had grown so scorching hot it branded her back through the tattered remains of her calico dress. The cheerful yellow flowers her mama had sewn onto the fabric just 2 months ago for her 10th birthday celebration had faded to the color of old parchment, and the dress itself hung in ribbons around her small, trembling frame like the remnants of a flag torn by prairie winds. She closed her sunburned eyelids against the merciless glare and desperately tried to summon memories of happier times when the world had been filled with love and laughter instead of pain and despair. The recollection that came to her most vividly was from just 6 weeks earlier, when Papa had spent an entire Sunday afternoon teaching her to whittle a wooden horse from a piece of cedar he had been saving for something special. Patience, little cricket. He had set his calloused hands guiding her small fingers as wood shavings curled around their feet like golden snow. The best things in this world come to those who take their time and do things proper. His voice had been warm with pride and infinite patience, the kind of steady presence that made a child feel safe in an uncertain world. She could still smell the cedar shavings, still feel the satisfaction of seeing the horse take shape under their combined efforts, still hear his delighted laughter when she had proudly shown him the finished product. Even more precious was the memory of Mama braiding wildflowers into her hair for the church social just a month before the nightmare began. Sarah Harper had hummed hymns while her gentle fingers worked their magic weaving daisies and black-eyed Susans into elaborate patterns that made Abigail feel like a princess from one of the fairy tales Papa read aloud on winter evenings. "You're my precious jewel," Mama had whispered, kissing the top of her head with lips that smelled of the lavender soap she made from flowers in their garden. "Never forget how loved you are no matter what troubles this world might bring." Those golden memories had sustained her through the first day and night of captivity. But now they kept dissolving like mirages in the desert heat, replaced by the nightmare that had shattered her world with the suddenness of a lightning strike. Papa's voice raised in defiant fury as he faced down the 3 armed men who had ridden up to their homestead with cruel smiles and hearts full of greed. "You can ride straight to hell, Henry Pike, before you'll get that deed from me." The sharp crack of gunshots had seemed to tear the very fabric of heaven apart. Mama's anguished screams as blood pooled beneath Papa's still form had echoed across the prairie like the cry of a wounded animal. But worst of all was the memory of Pike's rasping laughter as he snapped the iron cuffs around her wrists with the casual cruelty of a man swatting flies. "Don't you fret none, little bird," Pike had drawled through teeth stained yellow with tobacco and neglect. "Your Uncle Thomas down in Ash River's gonna be real cooperative once he knows we got his brother's precious little girl as collateral." Now the unforgiving sun beat down on her like the hammer blows of an angry god. The iron shackles had rubbed her delicate wrists raw and bleeding, creating crusted wounds that attracted lazy clouds of black flies she no longer had the strength to brush away. Her lips had cracked from thirst and begun bleeding, leaving a metallic taste in her mouth that mixed with the dust and growing despair. Above her, a turkey vulture completed another patient circle, dropping lower with each pass, as if testing her resolve to keep breathing in this furnace of suffering. The desolation around her seemed to mock any hope of rescue or redemption. No dust clouds on the distant horizon announced approaching riders. No jingle of harness or creak of wagon wheels suggested passing travelers who might take pity on a child in distress. The only sounds that reached her burning ears were the occasional cry of a red-tailed hawk somewhere in the crystalline air, and the distant rumble of thunder that promised rain but never delivered, just empty promises that made her parched throat ache with desperate longing. A different sound broke through her fevered despair. Not the thunder of salvation arriving across the prairie, but something subtle and deliberate, rustling in the thorny scrub brush that grew in stubborn patches behind the abandoned cabin. Her heart began hammering against her ribs like a caged bird as she strained to identify the source through the shimmering heat waves that made the landscape dance and blur before her sun-damaged eyes. Through the wavering air, a figure emerged from the mesquite and prickly pear with fluid grace that seemed to belong to the harsh landscape itself. At first, through her dehydration-addled vision, she thought it might be another cruel mirage conjured by her desperate mind. But as he stepped fully into the punishing light, she could see that this man was undeniably, impossibly real. He was tall and lean as a lodgepole pine, with copper-brown skin weathered by countless seasons under the open sky. Long black hair hung past his shoulders like a dark waterfall held back by an intricate beaded headband that caught the brutal sunlight in flashes of blue and white and red. His clothing was a fascinating mixture of white man's garments and traditional native dress, a faded blue cavalry jacket that had seen better days worn over supple buckskin leggings decorated with geometric patterns, sturdy leather boots that had walked many hard miles, and a wide-brimmed hat adorned with eagle feathers that danced in the slight breeze. This was a Cheyenne warrior, she realized, with a complex flood of emotions, fear, mixed with desperate hope, uncertainty tempered by an inexplicable sense that this imposing figure might actually be capable of helping her when no one else had come. The settlers around Bitter Creek told many stories about the tribes that still roamed these territories, most of them dark cautionary tales designed to frighten children into staying close to home and never wandering beyond the boundaries of what they called civilization. But as this man approached her, with careful, deliberately unthreatening movements, she saw something in his dark eyes that gave her the first real hope she had felt in 3 days, a profound sadness that seemed to mirror her own suffering, and an underlying strength that suggested he might possess both the will and the ability to help her. The warrior stopped approximately 10 feet away from her makeshift prison and studied her predicament with the analytical gaze of someone who had witnessed far too much cruelty and injustice in his lifetime. His weathered features grew progressively darker as he took in the iron shackles biting into her small wrists, the obvious signs of severe dehydration and sun exposure that marked her face and arms, and the general evidence of prolonged abuse that spoke of days of abandonment and suffering. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and careful, as if he understood exactly how frightened and vulnerable she was in this moment of extremity. "Little one," he said in English that was accented but remarkably clear and precise, "how long have you been chained to this post like an animal left to die?" 3 days. She managed to whisper through lips so dry they had begun to crack and bleed. The words emerged as barely more than a croak, her voice having nearly failed after so many hours without water under the merciless sun. The warrior's jaw tightened with barely controlled anger, not directed at her, she instinctively understood, but at whatever monsters had committed such an unconscionable act of cruelty against a defenseless child. He knelt beside her, with movements that were slow and completely non-threatening, reaching into a leather pouch attached to his belt, with the efficiency of long practice. "I am called Wikasa," he said as he produced what appeared to be a small metal tool fashioned from a horseshoe nail and carefully shaped to work on lock mechanisms. "These men who did this terrible thing to you, do you know where they went when they left this place of suffering?" "They took my mama." Abigail whispered, tears beginning to flow again, despite her body's desperate need to conserve every precious drop of moisture. "They shot my papa right in front of me, killed him in cold blood, like he was nothing more than a rabid dog, and then they dragged my mama away somewhere while I screamed and begged them to stop. The man with the horrible scar across his face, he said they'd come back for me. But that was 3 whole days ago, and I don't think anyone's ever coming to help me. Shh, Wicasa said with infinite gentleness, his fingers working with practiced skill at the complex lock mechanism that held her prisoner. You are not alone anymore, little one. I promise you that with everything I am and everything I believe. This man with the scar, it runs from his left eye down to his mouth. Does it not? Yes. Hope flared in her chest like a match struck in absolute darkness. You know him. You've seen him before. Henry Pike. Wicasa confirmed with grim certainty, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience with the outlaw's cruelty. He and his brothers have been cutting a bloody trail of death and destruction across 3 territories, leaving misery and devastation in their wake, like a plague of locusts consuming everything in their path. They attacked my people just 2 weeks ago, stealing horses and precious winter supplies from our camp, while most of our warriors were away hunting buffalo to feed our families through the coming cold months. He paused in his work on the lock, and Abigail saw something deeply personal and painful flicker across his weathered features like shadows cast by storm clouds gathering on the horizon. They may also know what happened to my younger brother Matto, who disappeared 3 months ago while working for a railroad construction company near the Dakota border. I have been tracking Pike's gang ever since, following rumors and whispers and the trail of bodies they leave behind, hoping to find some trace of what became of him. There was a soft, satisfying click, and suddenly the crushing weight of iron fell away from her raw, bleeding wrists. The relief was so overwhelming and unexpected that Abigail nearly collapsed backward onto the sun-baked earth. But Wicasa caught her with gentle hands that spoke of strength tempered by compassion, supporting her slight weight as feeling returned to her arms in waves of painful tingling that made her gasp and sob simultaneously. "Can you stand, little one?" he asked with the patience of a man who understood suffering and recovery in equal measure. She nodded weakly, though her legs felt like they were made of water that might spill onto the ground at any moment. With his steady support, she managed to rise to her feet on limbs that trembled with weakness and the after-effects of prolonged captivity. Then he pulled a leather water skin from his belt and held it carefully to her cracked, bleeding lips with the tenderness of a father caring for his own child. The water was warm from the desert heat, but tasted better than anything she had ever experienced in her young life. She drank greedily, desperately, her body crying out for the life-giving liquid that meant the difference between survival and death in this merciless landscape. When she had drunk enough to restore some strength to her voice, she looked up at this unexpected savior with eyes that shone with gratitude and wonder. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, studying his weathered face with the intense curiosity that was natural to children, even children who had seen too much of the world's cruelty. "You don't even know who I am or where I come from or why those men wanted to hurt me." Wicasa's expression grew thoughtful as he considered his response, seeming to weigh his words with the care of a man who understood their power to heal or harm. "The spirits guide us to where we need to be when we need to be there," he said with quiet conviction that seemed to come from the very core of his being. "Perhaps they brought me here to find you in your hour of greatest need, or perhaps they brought you here so that I could finally find the trail of the men who hurt my people and took my brother from us." He helped her sit in the precious shade cast by the cabin wall, then knelt in the dusty earth to examine the tracks and other signs around the hitching post with the professional thoroughness of a hunter who could read the story of what had happened in the marks left on the ground. "Tell me about this paper the outlaws wanted from your family," he said as he studied the hoofprints and boot marks that told their tale of violence and cruelty. "What made it so valuable that evil men would commit murder to possess it?" "Papa called it a land deed," she said, grateful to have something concrete and familiar to focus on, besides her fear and lingering physical discomfort. It showed the exact boundaries of our property, all legal and proper, with official stamps and signatures from the territorial government. But Papa always said there might be gold deposits somewhere on the land. He never looked for it himself, though always said farming was honest work that built character and fed families, while gold just made men crazy with greed and violence, and turned them into monsters who would kill for money. She paused, remembering her father's words, with painful clarity. Papa used to say that the earth gave up its treasures to those who worked hard and lived honest, but that men who tried to take shortcuts and steal what others had earned would find nothing but sorrow and damnation. Wicasa nodded with the grim understanding of a man who had seen too much of human nature's darker side. Pike and his gang have been following rumors of gold strikes all across the territory like carrion birds following the scent of death and decay. They're too lazy and cowardly to do the dangerous backbreaking work of prospecting themselves, so they prey on hard-working families who've done the honest labor of staking legitimate claims and building lives from nothing but hope and determination. He stood and brushed the dust from his hands, his expression growing increasingly urgent as he scanned the horizon with eyes that missed nothing. These tracks are 3 days old, but I can still follow them if we move quickly and the wind doesn't scatter the sign. The question that concerns me most is, what do we do with you? You're in no condition for a hard chase across dangerous country filled with hostile terrain and armed desperados. Before Abigail could formulate any kind of coherent answer to his dilemma, the ominous sound of multiple hoofbeats began echoing across the empty landscape, growing steadily louder and more distinct with each passing second. Both of them froze completely, every muscle tense with the awareness that danger was approaching rapidly and that their brief moment of hope might be about to end in violence and death. The sound resolved itself into the unmistakable rhythm of 3 horses moving at a steady ground-eating gallop, approaching from the direction of the main trail that connected the scattered homesteads across this remote corner of the territory. Like a lifeline of civilization in an ocean of wilderness and lawlessness. They're coming back, Wicasa said grimly, his hand moving with practiced instinct to the rifle slung across his back in a well-worn leather scabbard that spoke of long use and careful maintenance. We need to move immediately. Can you run on those weak legs? But even as he asked the question, they both knew they were already too late for any easy escape. 3 riders appeared on the crest of the low hill that overlooked the abandoned cabin, their horses kicking up impressive clouds of dust in the afternoon heat. Even at this considerable distance, Abigail could clearly see the cruel scar that marked the face of the man in the lead, like a brand of evil burned into his flesh by the devil himself. Henry Pike raised his rifle to his shoulder with the casual ease of a man who had killed many times before, and felt no more emotion about it than he would about swatting mosquitoes. He fired without warning, without negotiation, without even a shouted demand for surrender. The bullet struck the sun-baked earth near Wicasa's feet, sending up a spray of dirt and pebbles that stung their faces and announced his deadly intentions with crystal clarity. Well, well, well. Pike's harsh voice carried clearly across the intervening space, filled with the cruel satisfaction of a predator who had cornered his prey after a long and frustrating hunt. Looks like our little caged bird done found herself a friend and protector. Too bad for both of you that it ain't gonna matter one damn bit when all is said and done. What followed was not a simple chase, but a deadly game of cat and mouse that would test every survival instinct Wicasa possessed and push both him and Abigail to the very limits of human endurance. As more bullets began to splinter the weathered wooden walls of the cabin around them, filling the air with deadly splinters and the acrid smell of gunpowder, Wicasa didn't panic or flee randomly like a frightened animal. Instead, he moved with calculated purpose, using his intimate knowledge of terrain and tactics to turn their desperate situation to whatever small advantage he could find. At that dry creek bed behind the cabin, he said breathlessly as he scooped Abigail into his strong arms and sprinted toward the building's rear, dodging bullets that whined past their ears like angry hornets. When I create a distraction to draw their attention, you crawl along the bottom of it toward those cottonwood trees where my horse is hidden. Stay as low as possible, move slowly and quietly. And whatever you do, don't make any noise that might give away your position. What about you?" She asked, her voice trembling with fear for this man who had already risked so much to save her life. "I'm going to make them think we went in a different direction entirely." He replied with a grim smile that spoke of plans forming in his tactical mind. "Trust me, little one. I have been playing these games of survival for far longer than they have." Wicasa set her down behind a pile of split logs that provided some protection from the flying bullets, then immediately began implementing his strategy with the cool professionalism of a warrior who had faced death many times and learned to use his enemies' expectations against them. He fired 3 carefully aimed shots at the outlaw's position, making sure they could see the muzzle flashes and hear the distinct sound of his rifle. Then he ran openly across a patch of clear ground, making himself visible for several seconds before diving behind the cabin's far corner. The outlaws took the bait exactly as he had hoped they would, concentrating their fire on his new position, while Abigail crawled unseen through the shallow depression of the creek bed toward the trees where salvation waited in the form of a sturdy paint mare who had been trained to remain calm under fire. But Pike was no fool despite his cruelty and greed. After several minutes of trading shots with what he assumed was his quarry's main position, his tactical instincts began to warn him that something wasn't quite right about the situation. "Billy." He called out to one of his brothers, "Circle around to the back of that cabin and make sure they ain't trying to slip away while we're keeping them pinned down up here. Tom, you watch that creek bed real careful like. Something about this whole setup don't smell right to me." Wicasa had anticipated exactly this response, because he understood that Pike had survived as long as he had, by being suspicious and thorough rather than simply brutal. As one of the outlaw brothers began moving to flank his position, Wicasa slipped through a gap in the cabin's back wall, a hole he had spotted during their initial approach and filed away as potentially useful. The abandoned structure was falling apart from years of neglect, and the gap between 2 rotting boards was just wide enough for a man to squeeze through if he didn't mind scraping some skin off his ribs in the process. Now inside the empty cabin, he could see through cracks in the front wall that Abigail had made good progress toward the trees, crawling on her belly with a determination and courage that continued to amaze him. But the outlaw brother searching the creek bed was getting dangerously close to discovering her. And in another few moments, her escape route would be cut off entirely. Wicasa took careful aim through a crack in the cabin wall, steadying his rifle against the rotting wood frame, and drawing a bead on the man, threatening Abigail's escape. His shot was perfect, striking the outlaw in the shoulder and spinning him around with a scream of pain and rage that echoed off the canyon walls. Now Billy's hit. Tom shouted from his position near the creek bed, abandoning his systematic search to help his wounded brother reach cover. "He's bleeding bad." In that crucial moment of confusion and distraction, Wicasa burst from the cabin like a man possessed and ran with everything he had toward the cottonwood grove. He reached his horse just as Abigail pulled herself up the creek bank, both of them breathing hard but miraculously still alive, in a situation that should have ended in their deaths. "Can you ride?" he asked urgently, already boosting her onto the mare's broad back. "Yes," she said with more courage and determination than any 10-year-old should ever need to possess. They rode hard across the Wyoming prairie, but Pike's pursuit was neither random nor easily discouraged. The outlaw leader had tracked men across this territory before, and knew how to read sign, follow water sources, and anticipate the likely moves of desperate fugitives. This wasn't a simple chase driven by anger and bloodlust, but a carefully orchestrated hunt conducted by a man who understood that patience and intelligence were often more effective than speed and violence. For the next 2 days, they played a deadly game of endurance across some of the most unforgiving terrain in North America. Wicasa used every trick he had learned during his years as a warrior and hunter, riding through streams to break their trail doubling back on their own tracks to confuse their pursuers, choosing rocky ground that wouldn't hold clear hoofprints, and using natural landmarks to navigate toward their destination while making it as difficult as possible for Pike to follow. But Pike matched him, move for move, with a cunning that made their situation increasingly desperate. When they rode through water, he found the places where they had emerged on the far bank. When they doubled back, he spotted the signs and adjusted his course accordingly. When they chose rocky ground, he found the occasional scrape mark or disturbed pebble that marked their passage. The first night they made camp in a narrow canyon that offered both shelter from the wind and multiple escape routes if they were discovered. As they shared the last of their dried meat and tried to rest despite the constant fear of pursuit, Wycasa began to share more of his own story with Abigail, partly to distract her from their dangerous situation, and partly because he sensed she needed to understand why he was risking so much to help her. "My brother Matto was always different from other young warriors in our tribe," he said, staring into their small, carefully concealed fire that threw dancing shadows on the canyon walls around them. While most of us were content to follow the old ways of our fathers and grandfathers, he was endlessly curious about the white man's world, fascinated by their machines and their ways of building permanent structures that could last for generations. He paused to add another small stick to the fire, keeping the flames low to avoid attracting unwanted attention. That curiosity led him to seek work with the railroad company when they began laying track through our traditional hunting grounds. He wanted to earn money to help support our grandmother, but more than that, he wanted to understand how the white man's iron horses worked and how they managed to move such heavy loads across such great distances. Maybe he's still alive somewhere. Abigail offered hopefully, though she could see the pain that Wycasa was trying to hide behind his stoic warrior's mask. "Maybe," Wycasa replied, but his voice carried the weight of months of growing fear and uncertainty. "But Pike's gang has built a reputation for using forced labor on their illegal mining operations scattered throughout these mountains. Men go into those camps, and they don't come out either because they work them to death, or because they know too much about the gang's activities to ever be allowed to leave alive." Abigail studied his face in the flickering firelight, seeing depths of worry and grief that he was trying to keep hidden for her sake. "Is that why you're really out here in this dangerous country? Not just to help people like me, but to find your brother?" Wycasa nodded slowly, recognizing that this perceptive child deserved honesty rather than comfortable lies. "I have been following Pike's trail for 3 months, ever since Matto disappeared, without sending word to our family. Finding you was unexpected. But now your safety has become just as important to me as finding him, because I have seen what these evil men are capable of, and I cannot allow them to continue hurting innocent people." Their quiet conversation was interrupted by the sound of a small stone falling somewhere above them in the canyon walls, followed by the soft scrape of a boot against rock. Both of them froze, listening intently to the night sounds around them. Pike had found their hiding place again, but this time he wasn't attacking immediately. Instead, he was positioning his men for a coordinated assault that would seal off all escape routes and give his quarry no chance of survival. "There's another way out of this canyon," Wycasa whispered, pointing to what appeared to be a solid rock wall, but was actually a narrow crack barely visible in the darkness. "It leads to a system of caves that my people have used for generations as shelter during harsh winters and as hideouts when enemies came looking for us. But we have to reach it without them seeing us move, and that means crawling across 50 yards of open ground, while they're watching for exactly that kind of attempt." What followed was the most terrifying hour of Abigail's young life, as she and Wycasa played a deadly game of patience and stealth against men who were professional killers. While Pike and his brothers maintained their positions around the canyon, mouth believing their quarry was trapped like rabbits in a warren Wycasa, and Abigail began the painstaking process of crawling on their bellies across the open ground between their fire and the hidden cave entrance. Every few yards, They had to stop and wait in absolute stillness as one of the outlaws shifted position or called out softly to his brothers to coordinate their attack plan. Abigail's heart hammered so loudly in her chest that she was certain the sound would echo off the canyon walls and betray their location to the men who wanted to kill them. When a loose stone shifted under her weight during one of their moves, the scraping sound seemed as loud as a gunshot in the tense silence, and she was sure their hiding place had been discovered. But Pike's men were focused on the dying embers of their campfire, and the area immediately around it, not suspecting that their targets might be attempting such a desperate and dangerous escape route. Wykasa's knowledge of the terrain and his understanding of how attackers typically thought gave them the crucial advantage they needed to reach the crack in the rock wall, just as Pike apparently lost patience with the waiting game. "Burn them out." Pike's voice echoed harshly off the canyon walls, and flickering torchlight began to appear at the canyon mouth as his men prepared to flush out their quarry with fire and smoke. Wykasa pushed Abigail through the narrow opening first, then squeezed through himself just as the outlaws began their final assault on what they believed was an occupied campsite. The cave system beyond the entrance was a labyrinthine maze of passages that would take hours to search, assuming Pike even realized where his quarry had gone. They moved through the darkness, guided by Wykasa's intimate knowledge of caves his people had used for countless generations, following passages that led deeper into the mountain, and eventually emerged through another concealed entrance 3 miles away from where they had entered. When they finally crawled out into the pre-dawn darkness, they could see smoke rising from the canyon behind them as Pike vented his fury on their abandoned campsite. "He'll figure out what happened eventually," Wykasa said quietly, helping Abigail onto his horse as the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. "But it will take him most of the day to pick up our trail again, and by then we need to be in Ash River with your uncle, where we can find help and supplies." As they rode toward the mining town, following game trails and staying away from the main roads where they might be spotted, Abigail found herself thinking about what awaited them at their destination. Uncle Thomas had always been something of a mystery in her family, the younger brother who had left home to seek his fortune rather than staying to work the family farm alongside his older brother. Papa used to say that Uncle Thomas made choices that he couldn't understand, she said, as they crested a hill that gave them their first distant view of Ash River spread out in the valley below. He never wanted to talk about what happened between them, but I could see sadness in his eyes whenever Uncle Thomas's name came up in conversation. Wykasa studied the collection of rough buildings clustered around the mine entrances like mushrooms growing around fallen logs. Even from this distance, they could hear the constant pounding of the stamp mills processing silver ore, and see smoke rising from countless chimneys forges and cooking fires that marked it as a place where desperate men scratched out marginal livings in dangerous conditions. Men sometimes make different choices when they're faced with hardship and limited opportunities. He replied carefully, though something in his voice suggested he had his own concerns about what they might find when they reached their destination. "But family is family, and blood calls to blood. Surely your uncle will help us when he learns what has happened to his brother's family." Ash River proved to be exactly what Abigail had expected from the stories she had heard, a rough, dangerous place, where hollow-eyed men with blackened lungs spent their days underground, digging silver from reluctant rock, and their nights drinking away memories they couldn't bear to face in the harsh light of sobriety. The streets were thick with dust that never settled, and the air reeked of sulfur from the mining operations, and wood smoke from the countless fires needed to keep the stamp mills operating around the clock. The buildings were mostly rough lumber construction, with canvas or tar paper roofs thrown together quickly by men who didn't expect to stay long enough to worry about permanent construction. Saloons and gambling halls seemed to outnumber legitimate businesses, and the sound of raucous laughter, off-key singing, and breaking furniture drifted from these establishments at all hours of the day and night. Thomas Harper's house sat on the very edge of town, distinguishable from its neighbors mainly by its slightly better construction and a small vegetable garden that someone had attempted to maintain despite the harsh conditions and the constant layer of dust that settled on everything in a mining community. A single oil lamp burned in the front window, casting weak yellow light into the gathering dusk of another brutal day in the territory. When Thomas Harper opened his door in response to Wikasa's careful knock, Abigail barely recognized the man standing before her. The uncle she remembered from childhood visits had been thin but vital, with bright eyes and quick movements that spoke of energy and ambition. This man was gaunt to the point of appearing skeletal, with hollow eyes that darted nervously and the trembling hands of someone carrying a burden too heavy for his spirit to bear. "Abigail," he whispered, his face going pale as winter snow. "Dear God in heaven, child, what are you doing here in this God-forsaken place? Where's your father? Where's Sarah?" Papa's dead," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the grief that still felt like a knife in her chest every time she had to speak those words. "Outlaws killed him 3 days ago and took Mama somewhere. This man saved me from dying chained in the desert like an animal." Thomas's nervous eyes darted between his niece and the imposing Cheyenne warrior standing silently behind her. And Abigail noticed with growing unease that he seemed more fearful and agitated than relieved to see her alive and safe. His hands were shaking visibly, and there was something in his expression that reminded her uncomfortably of a cornered animal searching desperately for an escape route from an impossible situation. "Come inside quickly, both of you," he said with obvious urgency, ushering them through the doorway and immediately closing and bolting the door behind them with more force and haste than the situation seemed to require. The interior of Thomas's modest house was sparse but reasonably clean, though it had the distinctly sterile, unlived-in feeling of a place where someone existed rather than actually lived. The furniture was functional, but showed little care or personal attachment, and there were no photographs, personal mementos, or other signs of a life being actively lived rather than simply endured. Thomas lit several additional oil lamps with hands that continued to shake noticeably, then gestured for them to sit at his small wooden dining table that bore the scratches and stains of long use but little care. His movements were jerky and nervous, like a man who expected bad news or violence to arrive at any moment. "Tell me exactly what happened at your homestead," he said, though his voice carried a strange, hollow quality that suggested he might already know at least some parts of the story they were about to tell. Abigail carefully recounted the brutal attack on their family, describing in painful detail her 3 days of captivity, chained like an animal in the merciless desert sun, and their harrowing escape with Wikasa's invaluable assistance. As she spoke, she watched her uncle's face with increasing suspicion and growing alarm, looking for any signs of the duplicity and betrayal that seemed to lurk behind his nervous demeanor. When she mentioned Pike's name specifically, Thomas went completely still for just a moment, a reaction he tried to hide but couldn't quite manage. It was the stillness of a man who had heard a name he recognized, a name that carried personal significance and probably danger. "Henry Pike," Thomas repeated slowly, as if tasting the words and finding them bitter. "Yes, I've heard that name mentioned around town. Everyone in the territory has heard stories about him and his gang of cutthroats. You seem to know more about him than just his reputation." Wikasa observed quietly, his dark eyes never leaving Thomas's face as he spoke. "There's something in your voice that suggests personal knowledge rather than general awareness." "I don't know what you're implying," Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction and his eyes couldn't meet theirs directly. "Uncle Thomas," Abigail said softly, leaning forward in her chair with desperate hope in her young voice. "We need your help to save Mama from those terrible men who took her. If you know anything at all about where Pike might have taken her, anything that could help us find her before it's too late." Thomas stared at his niece for a long, agonizing moment, and she could see some kind of tremendous internal struggle taking place behind his bloodshot, haunted eyes. His shoulders gradually sagged, as if he were carrying an enormous weight that was finally becoming too much for him to bear alone. And when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "There's something I need to tell you both," he said heavily, each word seeming to cost him physical pain. "Something I've been living with for months now. Something I never thought I'd have to confess to another living soul." He stood up from the table with the slow, careful movements of an old man, though he couldn't have been more than 40 years old, and walked to a wooden chest in the corner of the room. When he opened it and pulled out a small leather pouch, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely maintain his grip on the object. When Thomas dumped the pouch's contents onto the wooden table, gold nuggets and silver coins scattered across the surface, with the distinctive sound of metal striking wood, clearly ill-gotten wealth that spoke of transactions no honest man would ever make. "Pike gave me these." Thomas whispered, his voice filled with shame and self-loathing so profound it was painful to witness. "Payment for information about your father and the exact location and contents of his precious land deed." The words struck Abigail like physical blows, driving the air from her lungs and making her feel dizzy with betrayal and crushing disappointment. Her own uncle, her father's flesh and blood, had actually helped the murderers who destroyed her family and left her to die, chained in the desert sun. "You helped them kill Papa," she whispered, unable to believe what she was hearing despite the damning evidence scattered before her eyes. "No," Thomas said desperately, reaching toward her with hands that shook with genuine emotion and what appeared to be sincere regret. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that at all. Pike swore to me on his mother's grave that they just needed to know about the deed's location and general value, that they would simply pressure your father into selling his claim for what they called a fair price, not hurt anyone in your family." But there was more to Thomas's story, and his guilt ran far deeper than simple greed or even cowardice in the face of threats. As the full truth spilled out of him like poison being drained from an infected wound, a much more complex and tragic picture began to emerge. "You don't understand the position I was in." Thomas continued, his voice breaking with the weight of months of suppressed guilt and fear. "Pike didn't just offer me money for the information. He had something else to hold over my head, evidence of what happened at the Copper Creek mine 5 years ago." Wicasa leaned forward, intently sensing that this was the crucial piece of the puzzle that would explain Thomas's seemingly inexplicable betrayal of his own family. What happened at Copper Creek? Thomas's hands shook as he poured himself a drink from a half-empty whiskey bottle on the shelf, downing the liquid in a single gulp, as if trying to find the courage to continue his confession. "There was an accident," he said finally. "A cave-in that killed 6 good men who were just trying to make honest livings to support their families. I was the foreman in charge of safety inspections, and I had, God help me, I had falsified the reports." The truth came pouring out of him now, as if a dam had finally burst after holding back a flood for too long. The mine owners were pushing for faster production, demanding that we extract ore at a rate that made proper safety precautions impossible. They were paying me extra money under the table to overlook problems with the support timbers and to sign off on areas of the mine that I knew were dangerous. Thomas's voice dropped to barely above a whisper as he continued his terrible confession. "When those 6 men died in the cave-in, I knew it was my fault. My greed and weakness had killed them as surely as if I had pulled a trigger. But I was too much of a coward to confess what I had done, so I falsified the accident report too, claiming that the collapse was due to an unexpected geological shift that no one could have predicted or prevented." Now the real scope of Pike's hold over Thomas became clear, and Abigail began to understand the impossible position her uncle had been placed in. "Pike somehow found out about the falsified reports," she said quietly. "He had copies." Thomas confirmed, his voice thick with shame and despair. detailed documentation that proved I was responsible for those men's deaths through negligence and corruption. When he came to me with his proposition about your father's deed, he made it clear that I could either cooperate with his plan or face murder charges for those 6 dead miners. This revelation transformed everything Abigail thought she understood about her uncle's betrayal. Thomas hadn't simply sold out his brother for gold and silver. He'd been trapped between 2 impossible choices, both leading to tragedy and destruction. Either he helped Pike obtain information about the deed, or he faced exposure as a man whose greed had killed 6 innocent workers. But that still doesn't justify what you did to our family, Abigail said, though her voice now carried less anger and more sadness as she began to understand the complexity of the situation that had led to this moment. No, it doesn't. Thomas agreed, his voice heavy with acknowledgement of his failures. I've been living with the guilt of both crimes every single day since it happened. When I heard that John was dead and you and Sarah were missing, I knew I had to find a way to make things right, even if it cost me my life. Before anyone could respond to this emotional revelation, the sound of approaching horses began to echo through the night air, growing steadily louder as multiple riders made their way through the streets of Ash River toward Thomas's house. Thomas peered carefully through his front window, and his face went white with terror at what he saw approaching. Pike, he whispered. He's here with both his brothers, and they're heading straight for this house. But instead of the immediate violence, they all expected, Pike's voice called out from the darkness with deadly calm. That was somehow more frightening than shouted threats would have been. Thomas Harper, I know you're in there with our property. Come on out into the open so we can discuss this situation like civilized men. What followed was not a quick shootout or immediate assault, but a tense siege that would last through the long hours until dawn. Pike was far too intelligent and experienced to simply charge the house where he knew armed and desperate men were waiting for him. Instead, he preferred to wear down his opponents psychologically, using fear and uncertainty as weapons that were often more effective than bullets. You've got something that belongs to us, Thomas, Pike called out in a conversational tone that made his words even more menacing. Send out the girl and the Indian, and maybe we'll forget about your recent lack of cooperation and breach of our business arrangement. From inside the house, they could see that Pike's men had taken positions around the building with professional efficiency, cutting off all obvious escape routes. One brother had positioned himself where he could watch the front door, and windows another covered the back of the house. And Pike himself had taken a spot where he could observe both sides of the building and coordinate his men's movements. There's a root cellar, Thomas whispered, pointing to a trap door near the kitchen that was partially concealed by a worn rug. It connects to an old mining tunnel that was dug years ago but abandoned when the silver vein played out. The tunnel runs under most of the town and comes up near the creek behind the old mill. What about you? Wicasa asked, already understanding that Thomas was planning some kind of desperate action that wouldn't include his own survival. I'm done running from what I have done, Thomas replied with a steadiness that surprised both of his companions. It's time I paid the price for my choices, both the old ones and the recent ones. But Abigail surprised them both with the strength of her response. No, she said firmly, her young voice carrying an authority that seemed far beyond her years. We don't leave people behind, especially family. If you're going to make things right, Uncle Thomas, then help us save Mama. Don't just throw your life away here for nothing. Her words seemed to give Thomas new resolve and a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in months. There might be a way, he said slowly, his mind clearly working through the possibilities. Pike doesn't know about the tunnel system, but he does know that I keep dynamite in my work shed for my mining activities. If I could create enough of a distraction, the plan they developed over the next hour was desperate, but carefully thought out, taking advantage of Pike's expectations and the terrain around Thomas's property. Thomas would use the dynamite to create a large explosion in his work shed, making Pike and his men think that their quarry was attempting to escape in that direction, or perhaps trying to destroy evidence of some kind. While the outlaws focused their attention on the fire and commotion, Wicasa and Abigail would slip through the root cellar and navigate the tunnel system to reach the abandoned mine shaft that opened near the creek. "Once you're clear of the immediate danger," Thomas told them as they prepared to implement their plan, "make your way to the Silver Knife Mine in the hills northeast of town. That's where Pike has established his main camp and base of operations, and that's where your mother will be held if she's still alive." As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they put their desperate plan into action. Thomas slipped out the back door of his house while Pike's attention was focused on the front, moving with surprising stealth for a man who had spent recent years behind a desk rather than in the field. Minutes later, a tremendous explosion lit up the pre-dawn darkness as the shed went up in flames, taking a significant portion of Thomas's house with it in a fireball that could be seen for miles. The explosion accomplished exactly what they had hoped it would. Pike and his brothers immediately assumed that their quarry was either trying to escape under cover of the chaos or attempting to destroy something valuable, rather than let it fall into outlaw hands. In the confusion that followed, with burning debris raining down and smoke obscuring visibility, Wicasa and Abigail slipped through the trap door and into the tunnel system that would carry them to safety. The underground passage was a narrow, claustrophobic space that had been carved through solid rock by miners who had hoped to strike it rich, but had found only disappointment. Water dripped constantly from the ceiling, and the air was stale and difficult to breathe. But it provided the concealment they needed to escape Pike's net. The explosion had also triggered a partial cave-in that blocked part of the tunnel system behind them, ensuring that even when Pike realized he had been tricked and came looking for another way to follow, he would find only collapsed earth and impassable debris. They emerged from the abandoned mine shaft as the sun rose fully above the mountains, both covered in mud and rock dust, but alive and free. Behind them, smoke still rose from the ruins of Thomas's house, and they could hear Pike's angry shouts echoing across the valley as he realized his quarry had escaped once again. "Is Uncle Thomas?" Abigail couldn't finish the question, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I don't know." Wicasa replied honestly, though his expression was grim. "But he gave us the chance we needed to continue our mission. Now we have to use that opportunity to save your mother and bring this nightmare to an end." The Silver Knife Mine proved to be everything Thomas had described: a perfect defensive position situated in a narrow box canyon with towering walls on 3 sides and only one entrance that could be easily defended by a small number of armed men. But Wicasa had been thinking about their approach during the ride from Ash River, and he had developed a plan that avoided the obvious frontal assault that Pike would be expecting. "Pike will have lookouts posted at the canyon mouth and probably men positioned on the rim above," he explained as they studied the mine complex from a concealed position among the rocks. "But there's another way to reach the interior through the old ventilation shaft that was carved into the east wall of the canyon." The shaft he was referring to was barely visible from their vantage point, appearing as little more than a dark crack in the rock face. But Wicasa's experienced eye could see that it was large enough to accommodate a human climber, and that it led directly into the heart of the mining operation, where Pike's gang had established their base. "It will be dangerous," he warned Abigail as they prepared for what would essentially be a mountain climbing expedition under combat conditions. "The shaft is narrow and the rock is unstable in places. One slip could mean a fall of hundreds of feet onto jagged stones below." "I'm not afraid," Abigail replied with quiet determination that continued to amaze the Cheyenne warrior. "Mama is depending on us, and I won't let her down." What followed was the most harrowing climb of either of their lives, as they worked their way up the rock face using handholds that were sometimes little more than tiny cracks in the stone. The ventilation shaft proved to be exactly as treacherous as Wicasa had warned, with loose rocks that could give way without notice, and sections where the walls were so smooth they offered almost no grip for human hands. More than once, Abigail found herself dangling over empty space, with nothing but Wikasa's strong grip on her wrist preventing a fatal fall. But her courage never wavered, and her determination to reach her mother gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. They finally reached the interior of the mine complex, just as Pike and his remaining men returned from their failed pursuit in Ash River. Tired and frustrated by their inability to recapture their escaped prisoners. From their hiding place among the mining equipment and ore carts, they could see Sarah Harper tied to a wooden post near the main entrance to the mine tunnels, guarded by a single outlaw, while the others rested and planned their next moves. "I'm going to create a distraction that will draw the guards away from your mother," Wikasa whispered to Abigail. "When the area is clear, get to her and be ready to run. We'll have only one chance to get this right." "What kind of distraction?" Abigail asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Wikasa pointed to several barrels of mining explosives that were stored near the entrance to the tunnels left over from the mine's operational days when blasting was used to extract ore from stubborn rock. "The kind that will make Pike think twice about following us out of this canyon." The final confrontation was not a heroic shootout, but a desperate flight from a mine that was literally coming apart around them. Wikasa's carefully placed charges brought down key support beams in a controlled collapse that blocked the main entrance and trapped Pike's men inside while providing the cover needed for their escape. But Pike himself proved too cunning to be caught so easily. As Wikasa freed Sarah Harper and Abigail led her mother toward their planned escape route through the ventilation shaft, Pike appeared from the shadows behind them with a gun trained on all three members of the Harper family. "End of the line for all of you." He snarled, his scarred face twisted with rage and frustration. "You've caused me more trouble than any of you are worth, and now it's time to pay the price for your interference." That's when Thomas Harper appeared at the mouth of the canyon, bloodied and burned from the explosion at his house, but very much alive, and carrying a rifle he had taken from one of Pike's men. He had followed their trail through the hills, determined to play a role in the final resolution of the crisis he had helped create. "Thomas," Pike said without turning around, his gun still trained on the Harper family, "I should have known you didn't have the backbone to die properly when that shed blew up." "Maybe I don't have much backbone," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite his obvious injuries. "But I've got enough spine for what needs to be done here." He didn't try to shoot Pike. Thomas had never been a gunfighter and knew he would likely miss at this distance. Instead, he did something that required far more courage. He charged directly at the armed outlaw, throwing himself between Pike's gun and his family. The struggle that followed was brief but decisive. Pike's gun discharged as Thomas tackled him, but the bullet went wide of its intended targets. Both men went down in a tangle of limbs rolling across the rocky ground as they fought for control of the weapon. When they finally separated, Pike was unconscious from striking his head against a mining cart, and Thomas was clutching his chest with blood seeping between his fingers. The bullet had found him during the struggle, but his sacrifice had saved his family and ended Pike's reign of terror in the territory. "Now get out of here," Thomas gasped as his strength began to fail. "The whole mine structure is unstable now, and more of it could come down at any moment." They carried him as far from the collapsing mine as they could, but the combination of injuries from the explosion and the gunshot wound proved too severe for his body to overcome. Thomas Harper died in the open air under the vast Wyoming sky, with his niece holding his hand and his sister-in-law offering words of forgiveness for his past mistakes. "I'm sorry," he whispered with his last breath, looking directly into Abigail's eyes. "I'm so sorry for everything I did and everything I failed to do." The collapse of the Silver Knife mine behind them was visible for miles across the territory, a towering pillar of dust and debris that marked the end of Henry Pike's criminal enterprise and the destruction of the forced labor camp that had been operating in the deeper tunnels of the complex. When territorial authorities arrived several days later to investigate the massive explosion and cave-in, they found Pike's body buried under tons of rock, along with evidence of the brutal conditions that had been imposed on workers who had been forced to extract silver ore under threat of violence and death. Among the items recovered from Pike's personal effects was a beaded belt clasp of obvious Cheyenne origin, which Wicasa recognized immediately as belonging to his missing brother, Maddo. But there was also something else that proved even more significant. A carefully hidden letter written in Maddo's own handwriting, apparently composed while he was held captive and waiting for an opportunity to escape. The letter revealed that Maddo was still alive, though he was being held under harsh conditions at a railroad construction camp near Fort McKinney. He had been attempting to escape from Pike's forced labor operation when he was recaptured, and his personal belongings had been taken as proof of his death, to discourage any rescue attempts by his family or tribal authorities. Armed with this information, Wicasa immediately began planning a rescue mission that would involve both military authorities from Fort McKinney and war parties from several Cheyenne bands. 3 months later, after a coordinated operation that combined the resources of the U.S. Army with the tracking skills and tactical knowledge of Native American warriors, Wicasa was finally reunited with his brother. Maddo had survived his months of captivity, though he bore both physical and emotional scars that would take years to heal completely. The reunion between the brothers was deeply moving for all who witnessed it, a reminder that love and determination could overcome even the most desperate circumstances. The Harper women settled permanently on their father's land, where they did indeed discover gold deposits sufficient to ensure their long-term financial security and independence. But the real treasure they had found during their ordeal was a deeper understanding of human nature, both its capacity for cruelty and its potential for redemption. Sarah Harper became widely known throughout the Wyoming Territory for her kindness to travelers and her willingness to help anyone in need, regardless of their race, religion, or background. She never remarried, choosing instead to honor her husband's memory by living according to the principles of honesty, hard work, and compassion that he had died defending. Abigail grew up to become a teacher and advocate for mutual understanding between white settlers and Native American communities. She maintained lifelong friendships with both Wicasa and Maddo, often serving as a translator and mediator when disputes arose between different groups trying to share the same land and resources. The small piece of iron chain that Wicasa had removed from her wrists became her most treasured possession, transformed from a symbol of captivity into a reminder of liberation and hope. She had it mounted on a simple silver chain that she wore around her neck for the rest of her life, and she often told people who asked about it that it represented the most important lesson she had ever learned. No bondage is permanent, she would explain. No injustice is beyond remedy, and no person is beyond the possibility of redemption. My Uncle Thomas made terrible mistakes that led to tragedy and suffering. But in the end, he chose to do what was right, even though it cost him his life. That final choice mattered more than all his previous failures because it proved that even the weakest person can find strength when it's needed most. Years later, when Abigail had children of her own and had become a respected leader in her community, she would often tell them the complete story of that terrible and wonderful summer when she was 10 years old. Her favorite place for these storytelling sessions was on the front porch of the house she and her mother had built on their father's land, where she could look out over fields of wheat and corn that grew where once there had been only wilderness. Once upon a time, she would begin settling into her rocking chair as the evening light painted the prairie in shades of gold. When I was just your age and thought I understood how the world worked, I learned that the most important lessons often come from the most difficult experiences. She would tell them about the Cheyenne warrior who had appeared from the desert, like an answer to prayer, teaching her that true courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act rightly despite being afraid. She would explain how her uncle's betrayal had ultimately led to his redemption, showing that people could change and grow, even in their final moments. And she would describe how the darkest chapter of her childhood had opened the door to a future filled with possibility and hope. But her favorite part of the story was always the description of the small piece of chain that she wore around her neck, polished until it gleamed like silver in the lamplight. "This reminds us," she would say, holding the transformed metal so her children could see how it caught and reflected the light, "that no form of bondage lasts forever, that no injustice escapes eventual correction, and that no soul is beyond the reach of redemption." When her children asked what had become of Wicasa and Mato, in the years since their rescue, she would point toward the garden where the two brothers could often be found during their regular visits, patiently teaching her own children the skills of tracking, hunting, and survival that their grandfather's generation had passed down through countless centuries. "Uncle Wicasa learned something important during our adventure," she would explain. "He discovered that sometimes our worst experiences teach us the most valuable lessons about helping others. That's why he spends part of each year working with the Army and territorial authorities, now making sure that no one else has to suffer the way we did in those terrible camps." And when they asked about the gold that had been found on their land, she would take them to visit the small stone marker that stood near the creek where her father had been killed. "The real treasure was never the gold hidden in the ground," she would say quietly. "It was learning that even when the world seems darkest and most hopeless, there are always people willing to risk everything to help others, and that the bonds we forge in times of trial are stronger than any metal and more valuable than any riches the earth might contain." The story always ended the same way, with Abigail showing them the polished piece of chain one more time as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "The physical chains that once bound me under that merciless sun are nothing but memory now," she would conclude. "But the bonds of love, friendship, and family that were forged during those terrible days will last forever, proving that hope can shine brightest in the darkest places, and that the human spirit is stronger than any force that tries to break it." The children would sit in respectful silence for a moment, trying to imagine their mother as a frightened 10-year-old facing such overwhelming dangers. Then the youngest would usually ask the question that children always asked, "Mama, do you think we'll ever see Uncle Wicasa and Uncle Mato again?" And Abigail would smile, looking out across the prairie toward the distant mountains where she knew her old friends still rode with their people. "The world is smaller than it appears, little ones," she would reply. "True friendship knows no boundaries of distance or time. Our paths will cross again when we least expect it. And until then, every sunrise reminds me that chains can be broken, hope can triumph over despair, and love is always stronger than fear." In the distance, carried on the evening wind across the endless Wyoming prairie, it sometimes seemed you could hear the echo of hoofbeats, a reminder that somewhere in that vast landscape, the spirit of adventure, the promise of justice, and the hope of redemption still rode free under the boundless western sky, waiting for the next opportunity to transform suffering into strength and darkness into light.